Hey team, Ben Lawless here. I'm going to talk to you about writing developmental rubrics. So the point of all of this stuff is that we want assessment to improve teaching rather than just use it for reporting to parents or the government. Just want to quickly talk about the benefits of rubrics for the three main users of them. So firstly, the students, obviously that's what we're all here for. They get a whole heap of high quality feedback. If you assess a student, you tell them a lot of things that they can do and a lot of things that they need to improve simply by shading 4 boxes in. When they get the feedback from the rubric as opposed to receiving critical feedback from a person's voice, it can often feel less judgmental and more likely that they'll act on it. And importantly, if you've got a well-written developmental rubric with potentially activities linked to the different criteria, then students can work through those at their own pace and we can achieve the holy grail of education, which is students regulating their own learning. It's also really good for growth mindset. The idea with this rubric is that everybody's just somewhere on that rubric and everyone's just trying to get better rather than having the obsession with, a letter or a number grade. Parents benefit, but obviously because their children are doing better in school. We have found that students, especially at the higher and the lower end of the ability spectrum, do a lot better with these rubrics because the lower students aren't being judged negatively and the higher students are being shown what it looks like to get better. For teachers, marking is faster. Now, it takes a while to develop rubrics in the first place, but once you've got good ones, your marking is going to be faster. It's going to be more consistent, not just within your team, but across year levels. Once everybody's on board about what the rubric means, there's less need for moderation of student work, although I will still recommend that you do it. If you want to target teaching, you can, because you'll be given students' zone of proximal development by plotting them on a rubric. One of the biggest side benefits that we've seen from this stuff is that the consistency of the teaching in the teaching team at a certain year level and between the year levels is increased greatly. And, even the act of developing a rubric means that your team have to agree on what the word analysis means and on what the 5 most important skills that you want to teach in a unit are, etc., etc. If you Google assessment rubric and look at the images that pop up, I would say 99% of them are rubbish, right? They're not that, they make it hard to mark. You can't get all the benefits that you get with developmental rubrics like plotting students' zone of proximal development, and they don't provide much teaching, so don't. These guidelines are based on work done at the Assessment and Evaluation Research Centre at Melbourne University. That's a link to the original 10 rules for writing quality criteria. What I'm going to show you is, having worked in the space for quite a few years, is more suggestion about the actual writing, but it's essentially the same philosophy behind it. Just a quick word on what we call things. So at Melbourne Uni, they have certain terminology, but out there in the real world, it's slightly different. So I just want to contrast those two. So Melbourne calls that an indicator and criteria. Most schools just call that a skill and what's in the box. Yeah. Melbourne calls one column or one row a rubric, and a whole set of them is called a criterion reference framework. It's a bit of a mouthful. That one's never really caught on. Whereas out there in teacher land, we just call the whole grid a series of different skills as a rubric. So there we go. Right, what do you need to write a developmental rubric from scratch? Most important thing are these 3 things. Learning taxonomies, which you can mix and match. That's completely fine. Work samples are a really good idea, especially if you're doing it from scratch. But if you've got a small experienced teacher team, that's probably the most important. I would say when you're doing a rubric from scratch, don't have more than 2 or 3 people. And then if you've got a bigger teaching team, just take it to the bigger group later. So let's get into the guidelines. Every criteria going up should describe a student performing something at a higher and higher level of quality. So you can get help from some of those taxonomies. Bearing in mind, taxonomies are not actually real. They are just theorists' approximation of what it looks like for students to demonstrate something at higher levels of sophistication. So here's a very simple example of Bloom's taxonomy criteria. you should only describe one thing in each criteria, right? So look at this example, identify and describe. You get a problem because what if a student can do one thing but not the other? So you got a couple of choices there. Either just get rid of one of them, maybe one of those skills is not very common in your classroom. Split it into two, so you have identify and then describe, because describe's more difficult. Or you might look there and go, hang on, actually there's an entirely separate second skill. So in this example here, we split it into easier and harder. Now, we can't observe what students understand, know, or think, or believe. We can only observe what they do that's externally observable. So what they do, say, make, or write. Yeah. So we can't directly observe whether a student understands trigonometry. We can only observe whether they can use the knowledge to solve a problem. In the interests of benefiting the people that use the rubric, and in particular I'm talking about teenagers or young people, people don't want to read more than they need to, so you want to get those criteria as short as possible. I'm not a big fan of using I can at the start of criteria. I know a lot of primary schools do that, that's fine. I just find it's an extra 2 words that don't add any meaning. Try and even get rid of all the tiny little words that you can. So like here's a word salad here, how can we shorten that to something like that? We don't want to lose any of the meaning, I'm not saying that, but we want to try and make those criteria as short as possible for parents and students reading the criteria. If they're too long, they won't get read. Now let's talk about things we don't want to see in criteria. We do not want to see counting or pseudo-counting, so something like this is not great. And why do we not want to count stuff? Well, it's not usually true that just more of something means that it's better. We want to think more like, what function can the learner achieve if they're doing that thing more often, right? So in this example, it's not necessarily the number of quotes that's the most important thing. It's what can the student achieve by using more quotes. And from the point of view of trying to determine a student's point of readiness or what they can do, if they can do it sometimes, that means they can do it. Possibly they just need a reminder to do it more often, but in terms of their actual skill level, if they can do it, they can do it. Maybe they're just not doing it consistently, but we don't want to measure consistency in a developmental rubric. So how can we improve that quote one? There we go. The second one shows the function that the student can achieve if they use more quotes or more relevant quotes. We also don't want to see criteria being repeated, right? So you often see the highest criteria in a rubric has got all of the lower criteria written in it. You just need to teach people how to understand a rubric. Basically, if you are marked in a certain box, you can do everything up to and including what's in that box. Otherwise, you end up with these really long criteria. So the stuff highlighted there is just repetition of lower criteria. We also don't want to see successive criteria describing steps in a process, because obviously each of those steps themselves has different levels of quality. So a classic one you see for essay writing, obviously that's no good because introductions, paragraphs, and conclusions can all individually be performed at various levels of quality. So if we were going to be talking about essay structure overall, the lowest level is simply having the ingredients, and then higher levels, we've found, marking lots of essays, that students, once they've got the structure in place, then they start to develop the ability to write topic sentences and linking sentences. This is in the paradigm of teaching Teal essay structure. Criteria should also avoid ambiguous language. This is probably the most common thing that we see out there in rubrics that could be improved. If there's adverbs and adjectives, I highly recommend questioning whether they should be in there. So all this kind of stuff here. So all these words, this is so common in a lot of the published curriculum documents that we see. What do any of these words mean? The point of a developmental rubric is to demystify what it looks like to get better at something. And if we're just replacing the mystery with other mysterious words like suitable and sophisticated, we're not really doing much. So here's an example here from the curriculum document. What do these words mean? And they don't provide any support for learning. Like if a student is adequate, that's great. What do they need to do to get better? your analysis needs to be detailed. But what does that mean? Doesn't say in here. We also want to avoid negative language. I'll give you an example here. So lacks tone. If you want to tell a student that they lack tone, instead of being harsh and saying something mean like that, you can simply have a criteria below the tone one, and then if they got a 1, they can work out for themselves that they didn't use tone to enhance their speech. The reason why we don't want to have negative language is it's demotivating. Most students often experience negative effects from the negative judgment they get from assessment. So if we can remove the emphasis on that as much as possible. Also, the point of developmental assessment is to determine what the student can do and then possibly provide teaching interventions at that point. We're not trying to find out what they can't do. Some more writing advice here. Highly recommend that you have every single skill and criteria starting with a verb. It makes it easier to read, right? Especially students who are learning, who are developing their literacy skills. If they had to figure out, what is it that I'm doing? Where's the verb in there? It gets confusing. So on that same note, sentences should be active, not passive. It's much harder for people to understand a passively written sentence. Have the verb that you want students to be doing right out there at the front. Now, this is more advice about rubric construction. These are not hard and fast rules. This is just some rules of thumb. If you need to break any of these rules, that's fine. I would just say make sure that you've got an educationally valid reason for doing so and that you've at least considered the reasons why it is a guideline. So we would recommend not having more than 4 criteria, so 4 different levels. If you're making a bigger, like a progression or something, that's fine. What I mean by 4 criteria per skill, I'm talking about in one individual assessment task. There's a couple of different reasons. The first one, the more criteria you have, the harder it is to mark, and the more inconsistent the marking will be, not only your own marking, but between you and other people doing the marking. It's also common, this is something Patrick pointed out, that if you have 5 criteria, once teachers get bored of marking, they'll often just give them the middle one. Kind of like when those Likert scales with the 5 levels. After about question 50, you just start putting the middle one each time. And, typically in a class of 25 to 30 students, it's unlikely there's going to be a whole heap more than 4 levels in a certain skill. So they're not needed. Having said that, the younger the students are, the less criteria should be in an assessment task rubric, I would say. So, a really simple one we do with our year 7s right at the start of the year is 3 skills, 3 criteria each. That's only 9. Whereas when I'm marking master's level students, there could be 15, 20 criteria because they can handle more feedback. There's no point giving students more feedback than they can cope with or deal with. This same point applies to how many different skills that you want to have in your rubric. I recommend, it really depends on the learner. For year 7s, we probably wouldn't want to have more than 4 or 5 skills. When you get up to year 12, possibly more. It's too hard to mark. You're giving them too much feedback that they can't act on. One sneaky thing that we have started doing though is the problem is if you don't put a skill on a rubric, students get the message that they don't need to try in that skill. So what we've started doing is having, say, 8 skills on the rubric with criteria. Students see all that stuff, but then we choose to only mark, say, 4 out of the 8, but we don't tell the students in advance. So we might put bibliography on the rubric, but we might not mark it. And we change which ones we mark each time. So here's an example of a rubric that breaks that rule. 36 criteria. I mean, it's got a whole heap of other problems as well, but that's just way too much feedback. Your typical high school learner is going to struggle to deal with that. Now, I just want to go through a few words and phrases that I would recommend you do not use. Attempt. You often see people trying to write attempt when they're trying to think of a criteria that's lower than the one they want to get students to get to. Problem is that doesn't say what the student's doing, it says what they're trying to do, and attempts can look like all different kinds of things. I would avoid with teacher support because we're trying to determine what the student can do by themselves, And you could have a second version of every single criteria that said with teacher support. So I don't think there's much point. With and, this often is a red flag to suggest that you're trying to squeeze two things into one criteria. With adverbs and adjectives, these usually suggest that there's ambiguity. I would say instead of using an adjective or an adverb, find a better verb, a more specific verb, a more powerful verb or noun or whatever it is. Correct and accurate, I don't think these are required, because if the skill's not performed correctly or accurately, then just don't assess it at that level and just explain that's how you interpret these rubrics to everybody using it. Finally, as mentioned, we cannot assess knowledge or understanding directly, so these words should not be appearing on our rubrics. And my most recent bugbear is demonstrate awareness of. How do they demonstrate the awareness? Put the verb that tells you how they demonstrate that awareness instead of writing demonstrate awareness. So how do we construct a rubric? My recommendation, something like this. I know this is going down to up, most go left to right now, but you get the idea. So I would chuck in a not shown there that says if the student hasn't completed that part of the task. Write your skills in first, starting with verbs. I find it's easiest to write the lowest and the highest criteria first. So for us, when we're writing individual assessment task rubrics for one task, we write something that everyone in the class can do, because we're trying to capture the full diversity of ability. Top criteria should be a stretch target that only probably about 10% of your students can get. If you're finding too many students are getting that top criteria, then next time you do that task, you want to write an even harder one. You want to be showing those top students descriptions of what it looks like to get better. So once you get your bottom and your top, then you add in a couple of middle ones in the middle. The jump in difficulty does not need to be precise between these different criteria. It's more about what are the most common things that students in your class are going to be doing. So, for example, one that I see that appears a lot is analyze, which I'm not convinced is actually something that is as desired as we might think. And it's a good idea to have an interpretation statement just explaining to the users of the rubric how to read it. I would plonk that on every single rubric. Or if people know how to do it, they don't need to see that each time. Finally, just a couple of things that I've picked up on in the last couple of years in my own work on this stuff. People blindly apply some of these learning taxonomies. It's quite often to see criteria that just go identify, describe, explain, analyse, evaluate. Now, they might describe levels of performance, but it's to me way too coincidental that every single class of every different year level has the exact same 5 levels. It's unlikely. I don't think that, for example, as I said, analysis is as desired or as commonly demonstrated. You could have a rubric that has 3 different uses of the word describe, but the thing that they're describing gets more complex. So use the taxonomies, mix the taxonomies if you need to, but the point here is that we're trying to describe what we observe students doing. We're not trying to match it blindly to some taxonomy from last century. And secondly, I would normally say you can't get 2 verbs into a criteria. However, if you have what I'm calling a cause and effect criteria, you can do, and it can be a really big help. In this example, analyze writing technique. So that's quite open. That might be hard for the users of the rubric to go analyze writing technique. Yeah, but for what purpose? If you then add what the effect is supposed to be of that analysis, that's much more specific criteria. We want them to analyze, but in their analysis it must have determined the author's intent, otherwise they're not getting that criteria. So that can be a good way to go. Here's some quotes from some students, all in their own words, who have been using developmental rubrics. I guess this is kind of like a very informal way of me suggesting that they're successful. And finally, that is the summary of the guidelines. Thanks very much. Keep it real.